I stood on the porch of the finest house in Ashford Hollow holding my daughter, who was 1 day old, next to 2 suitcases I hadn't packed myself. The oak door in front of me had a chain lock across it. Through the gap, my mother-in-law's face was calm, arranged like she'd rehearsed this in a mirror. She told me there was no room in her house for a wife who didn't earn her place. Behind her, somewhere upstairs, I knew my husband was standing at a window. I didn't have to look up to know he wouldn't open it. "I want to tell you," I said something sharp. I didn't. I stood there in the June heat, doing what I've always done when the ground disappears under me. I started counting. The suitcases. The steps down to the sidewalk. The exact number of days it had taken this family to decide I was a debt they no longer wanted to carry. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 31. And this is the story of how I found out that the family I married into had never really let me in, and how the woman who raised me had been quietly holding the one thing that could bring the whole house down, for 4 years without ever saying a word. Let me take you back to where it started because none of this makes sense without her. I grew up with my mother, Margaret Dawson, in half of a rented duplex on the working side of town. My father left when I was small enough that I don't remember his voice, only that he existed. Margaret worked 30 years at the county title office, reading mortgage papers for a living. Other people's dreams stacked in folders, crossing her desk one signature at a time. She wasn't a woman who hugged you when you were sad. She was a woman who checked your tires before winter. Her one rule, repeated so many times it became scripture in our house, was simple. Read it before you sign it. If they won't let you read it, that's your answer. We weren't poor. We were careful. And carefulness when you're a kid doesn't feel like safety. It feels like being on the outside of a warm window looking in. On my walk home from school, I used to pass the big houses on the hill, porch lights on, whole families around a table, a name everyone in town already knew and respected. I wanted that. Not the money. The belonging. The Bennetts were that family in Ashford Hollow. 3 generations, a furniture company with their name over the door downtown, a photograph taken every Christmas in front of the same fireplace for the local paper. When people said, "Bennett," their voice changed a little, like they were bowing without noticing. I was 12 when I finally asked my mother why we couldn't be a family like that. She didn't even look up from her plate. "We don't buy names, Claire," she said. "We buy ground." I thought it was a nice thing tired women say to make peace with what they don't have. It took me almost 20 years to understand it was a warning. I met Daniel Bennett through work. I run my own bookkeeping practice, small businesses, tangled ledgers, the kind of quiet math most people avoid. His family's furniture store hired me to sort out their inventory accounts, and Daniel was the one assigned to sit across from me while I did it. He was easy to like. He remembered how I took my coffee. He laughed at his own family's old habits instead of making excuses for them. I fell for him the way you fall for anything dangerous, slowly and then all at once. 8 months later, he brought me home to meet his parents. His mother, Patricia Bennett, looked me over the way you'd examine a chair someone claimed was an antique, checking the joints for glue. Her first question wasn't about who I was. It was Dawson. Now, whose people are the Dawsons? When I told her my mother worked at the title office, something behind her eyes closed like a drawer. We married at the country club under a tent Patricia chose, in front of 200 guests I mostly didn't know. I'd wanted something small by the lake. I lost that fight before I even realized we were having one. The only thing I held on to was my own name. When Patricia found out I hadn't taken theirs, she told me, not quite joking, that Bennett brides had always been grateful for the honor. My mother, standing near the punch bowl in her one good dress, said nothing. Her eyebrows said everything. The plan was to live with his parents for a year or two while we saved for our own place. A big house, an east wing that was practically its own apartment, Daniel said. You can hear the word I should have questioned. Practically. 2 weeks in, Patricia knocked on our door holding a leather ledger book. Every couple under her roof contributed to the household, she explained. The way you'd explain gravity was simply how things worked. $800 a month, written down with everyone's initials in a column, like a boarding house from another century. And then, almost as an afterthought, delivered like a compliment, Since I was so good with numbers, would I mind keeping the family's books too? For free, of course. Family helps family. I said yes before I'd even set down my coffee. I felt chosen. The girl from the duplex handed the keys to the castle's accounts. My mother would have read that arrangement twice and slid it back across the table. I signed it with a smile, because nobody had ever handed me anything to actually read. Once I had the books in front of me, the truth came fast. The Bennett income had been shrinking for a decade. 2 big box stores had opened outside town and eaten into the furniture business, but the spending never slowed down. Club dues, galas, a landscaping crew, wine deliveries. The house still lived like it was 1995. I built a gentle plan to trim costs. Patricia listened the way a queen listens to whether she has no plans to experience, then folded her hands and said, "This family doesn't live like accountants, dear." Meeting over. One line in those books wouldn't leave me alone, though. Every month, $940 went out on autopay to something called Fieldstone servicing. No file. No explanation. When I asked Patricia, she said Richard handled that. When I asked Richard, my father-in-law, he turned up the television and asked if I'd ever seen a golf swing like the one on screen. I let it go. I want you to remember that I let it go. Behind the main house sat an old carriage house. 2 stories, good brick, full of dust and mouse droppings since sometime around the Nixon administration. Patricia offered it to us one night over dessert like a gift. "Fix it up," she said. "Every young couple needs their own nest." I cried at the table. The next morning, carefully, I asked if we could put something in writing, a lease, anything with ink on it. Patricia looked at me like I'd asked her to sign a receipt for a hug. "Family doesn't do paperwork, dear." I asked Daniel to push for it. He kissed my forehead and said the sentence I'd hear in my sleep for years afterward. "It's my parents, Claire. I promise you can trust me." So I did it myself. I opened my savings, every dollar I'd earned one client at a time, and spent $38,000 turning that carriage house into a home. I kept every receipt in a folder in my office. I chose the doorknobs myself, real brass, warm in the hand. I loved that house the way you love something you're secretly building your whole future inside. That winter, 2 pink lines appeared on a test in our bathroom. Daniel put his chin on my head, standing in the half-finished nursery, and said, "Crib goes there." I believed for exactly that moment that we'd made it. Patricia's reaction to the pregnancy came in 2 parts. First, real joy, she clapped, glowing, and for a few seconds I saw the warmth Daniel always swore was in her somewhere. Then, before the pie was even served, she folded her napkin and asked how I planned to manage my little business now, since clients could be so demanding and I'd be needed at home. Not "how are you feeling?" "How are your months going to look?" I didn't understand yet that from that moment on, in the ledger she kept in her head, I'd moved from asset to liability. At 6 months, I started bleeding in the middle of the night. I spent it in a hospital bed listening to our daughter's heartbeat gallop on a monitor. The diagnosis had a long name. The instructions were simple: bed rest, no stress, nothing that raises your blood pressure. My income from 4 remote clients kept us afloat. I lost the other 9. The first month I could only put $500 in the household envelope instead of 8. I wrote Patricia a note explaining, and promised to catch up. 2 mornings later, the ledger appeared on my breakfast tray, open to that month, my initials at the top of the column, and beside them in her fountain pen a small, neat red circle. Nothing was said. Nothing ever was in that house. That was the whole design. By the time I was allowed downstairs for dinner again, I sat at that table like furniture that happened to talk. If I mentioned the nursery, the subject changed within 2 sentences. Patricia told stories at dinner that all had the same moral, delivered to no one and meant for me, about how women in this family had never been delicate, how she'd hosted 40 people on her feet the week she was pregnant with Daniel. He would go quiet under the weight of it. Not cold. Quiet. He'd squeeze my knee under the table, a private little telegram that said sorry, you know how she is, and say nothing above the tablecloth. I learned that a squeeze under a table is what surrender feels like when it still loves you. So I did the thing my mother's daughter does. I kept my own notebook in my nightstand, separate from Patricia's ledger. Every household payment dated. Every carriage house invoice, cross-referenced to my folder. $38,000 in renovations. $33,000 in 3 years of household contributions. I wasn't planning anything yet. I was just a bookkeeper laying sandbags out of habit. The carriage house was finished the week I hit 8 months. Brass knobs. My window exactly where I'd fought for it. I asked when we could move in. And the stalling began. So smooth it took me 2 weeks to notice it as stalling. After the inspection. After the insurance is sorted. After the baby comes, we'll see. Then one afternoon from our bedroom window, I watched 2 men carry folding tables and boxes of Heritage Committee files across the garden and into my carriage house, my kitchen, my brass, my window, and stack them exactly where the crib was supposed to go. Patricia directed them with one finger, pointing which of my rooms would hold which of her boxes. When I asked at dinner, she said only, "Storage temporarily. It's not as if anyone's living there." Then she took the key. I'd kept it on my everyday ring, heavy old-fashioned brass, warm in my pocket like a promise. A week after the boxes moved in, Patricia stopped me in the hallway, palm already out. The painters needed access, she said. And in my condition she couldn't have me running around after them. I looked at that open hand and heard my mother's voice in my ear. "If they won't let you read it, that's your answer." And I was 36 weeks pregnant and too tired to fight a woman who never raised her voice. I worked the key off the ring and set it in her palm. She closed her fingers around it and smiled. "There. Isn't that simpler?" She never gave it back. Our daughter Grace was born 2 days after my due date, 7 pounds even, with a cry like a fire alarm. My mother sat with me through 14 hours of labor, reading a paperback between contractions like a woman standing guard at a border, which I would soon learn was exactly what she was doing. Daniel arrived late, apologizing about an emergency meeting at the store, something about the bank, something he'd explain later. Patricia visited for 10 minutes that evening. She looked into the bassinet at her first grandchild and said flatly, "A girl." Then she straightened the flowers my mother had brought and left, mentioning that the house would be busy that weekend with a committee event. That night, in the dark of the hospital room, my mother said something strange. "When they discharge you, you go back to that house. If anything happens, you call me before you argue with anyone. Promise me." I laughed. She didn't. I promised, and I didn't ask why, because some part of me already knew she'd tell me the truth, and I wasn't ready for it yet. Discharge morning came bright and ordinary. Daniel texted at the last minute. A crisis at the store, he couldn't leave, take a cab, he'd meet us at home. I strapped Grace's carrier into the back seat of a taxi and gave the driver the address on the hill, the one with the stone gate, and felt, God forgive me, a small flicker of pride saying it out loud. The cab pulled away and left us on the sidewalk. All the windows of the house were shut. On the porch in the shade sat 2 suitcases. I knew their shape the way you know your own handwriting. The navy set, a wedding gift, my winter coat folded on top in a neat square. Someone had packed for a season I wouldn't be spending there. I climbed the porch steps on legs I couldn't quite feel and put my key into the lock. It went in half a turn and stopped. New lock. Bright brass, fresh from a locksmith's screwdriver. I rang the bell of the house I had lived in for 3 years, holding the daughter I'd brought into that name the day before, standing beside my own packed luggage. Footsteps. The door opened 4 inches and caught on the chain. Through the gap, Patricia's face was calm, pearls already on at 10 in the morning, like she'd been expecting to give this speech all along. "Daniel needs a clean start," she said. "And this household needs contributors. You've been a lovely guest, dear. But guests don't stay forever." Behind her, deeper in the house, I heard a floorboard creak, and then go still. Someone choosing to stay hidden. "Patricia," I said, "I live here." She tilted her head and looked at me the way you look at someone collecting a debt you have no intention of paying. "Who do you think packed the suitcases, dear?" Then she said the line the whole town would eventually hear about, delivered in the same calm voice she used for reading line items she'd already decided to cut. "There's no room in this house for a useless wife." The door closed. Not slammed, clicked shut gently, which is worse. Slamming at least is a conversation. I stood on the porch of the finest house in Ashford Hollow, holding my one-day-old daughter, next to a winter coat folded for a winter I apparently wouldn't spend inside those walls. Above me, an old window frame creaked. Second floor. Our bedroom. I stepped back into the sun and looked up, and there was Daniel, arms crossed, close enough to have heard every word through glass he hadn't bothered to open. We looked at each other for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away first and did nothing in the house his grandfather built, while his wife and daughter stood on the sidewalk with their luggage. I didn't knock again. I didn't argue with a closed door. I sat down on the bigger suitcase, took out my phone, and called the one person who had told me 3 years too early to make sense that this day might come. "Mom," I said. "It happened. The thing you made me promise about." There were 4 seconds of silence on the line. Then my mother's voice came back, so level it frightened me more than shouting would have. "Are you and the baby safe? Are you sitting down?" 20 minutes. The line went dead. No questions about what or why or how they could do this, as if she'd been sitting by the phone for 3 years with her coat already on. I held my sleeping daughter in the June heat and waited. And 20 minutes later, almost to the second, a gray sedan turned the corner onto Bennett Land, my mother behind the wheel driving faster than I had ever once seen her drive, and in the passenger seat, a man I didn't recognize, holding a leather briefcase like it was the only thing standing between that house and the ground it was built on. The car stopped at the curb. Both doors opened at once. My mother came around from the driver's side in her work blazer, and stepped out of the passenger side, a silver-haired man I'd never seen in my life, carrying that briefcase like it had weight beyond its leather. "Baby first," my mother said. She took Grace from my arms and held her for 10 long seconds with her eyes closed, like she was drinking water after a long shift. Then she handed her back, nodded toward the man beside her and said, "Claire, this is Walter Hale. He's been my attorney for 11 years. Get in the car. I don't do business on other people's sidewalks." We didn't go far, just around the corner under a big oak engine off. And there in a parked car, with my daughter asleep against my chest, my mother opened a folder she'd clearly been carrying for longer than that morning, and set the first page down on the center console. The letter had read Fieldstone Servicing, LLC. I knew that name. $940 a month autopay, memo line always blank, going out of that house for years. I looked at my mother. "You know about this?" She glanced at me, almost apologetic. "The servicing company just collects it, Claire. The note behind it is mine." I do this kind of math for a living, so I understood before Walter said a word. The Bennett house, the stone gate, the oak door, the chain lock, all of it, carried a private mortgage. Not from a bank. Banks had turned them down years earlier. It came through a private lender, and private notes get bought and sold quietly, the way old furniture changes hands at estate sales. 4 years ago, the note secured against the finest address in Ashford Hollow had been bought by a one-woman company registered to a rented duplex on the working side of town. "Mom," I said, "you own their house." "I own the debt sitting on their house," she corrected, the way she'd correct a new hire at the title office. "Different thing." From the back seat, Walter added, dry as a tax form, "As of 90 days ago, the family is $11,300 behind." Which frankly makes today less unusual than it sounds. My mother told me the rest with both hands still at 10 and 2 on the wheel, like she needed the discipline of driving to say it out loud. 30 years at the title office meant 30 years of watching this town's paperwork cross her desk, including the Bennetts more than once. A refinance in the 90s. Another after the big box stores opened. Each one a little more creative than the last. "Names age like roofs," she said. "From the street you can't tell. From the paperwork you can." 4 years earlier, right around the time I got engaged, a broker's flyer had crossed her desk. A private note for sale, well-secured, local. She recognized the address before she finished the first line. My mother, who has never once bought a lottery ticket, cashed out a retirement account, and bought the mortgage on the house her daughter was about to move into. "Why?" I asked. She was quiet for a second. Because you were going to be living under that roof and I'd read what was holding the roof up. You by the field between your house and a wildfire, Claire. That's all this ever was. She never told me, she said, because if I'd known, I couldn't have lived there honestly. And if they'd known, I'd have paid for it in 100 small ways before it ever came due. So the company stayed quiet. When the payment started slipping last spring, she told the servicer to be patient, because her daughter and her grandchild were sleeping inside those walls. This morning, she said, your mother-in-law solved that problem for me. She turned the key herself. That night in my mother's spare room, with Grace asleep in a crib my mother's attorney had somehow assembled himself, I sat with that folder on the dresser and let myself feel the pull of it, the temptation to burn the whole thing down. I imagined the foreclosure notice in the paper, the Heritage Committee reading it over coffee, an auction sign zip-tied to that stone gate. It tasted like sugar tastes when you're sick. Right and wrong at the same time. Because at the end of that daydream was always Grace, 5 years old, asking why her other grandmother had nowhere to live, and me handing her a war instead of an inheritance. So I did what I actually know how to do. I took a pencil and in the back of the baby's feeding log, wrote 3 lines like a woman closing out a hard year. Burn it down. Or use the note to force the door back open and make them take me in, the wife with leverage now. Or collect exactly what was owed to the dollar and close the account for good. I sat with the second option the longest. The old hunger has a long memory. But then I heard Patricia's voice again in my head. There's no room in this house for a useless wife. And realized that forcing my way back in would just be the same house with the collar moved to a different neck. I circled the third option and didn't look back. In the morning my mother asked me straight, over eggs, salt still in her hand. I can call the loan tomorrow. Accelerate, foreclose the whole process. Walter says we'd win and win ugly. Or I can quietly sell the note back to some fund and let gravity handle the Bennetts on its own, because gravity usually does. She set the salt down. It's not my sidewalk they left you on, so it's not my call. What do you want? What she was really asking underneath all of it was the question she'd been asking my whole life without ever using these words. Who do you want to be about this? I looked at Grace in her bassinet, one day into a life she hadn't earned and didn't owe anyone for. And I answered as the only thing I actually am. Not a Bennett and not a victim. A bookkeeper. I want to close the account, I said. Correctly. To the dollar. And be done. Walter drew it up over a second pot of coffee. A formal notice of default, real and legally loaded, because people like the Bennetts don't answer a knock unless it's heavier than they are. Alongside it, my own claim, $38,000 in unjust enrichment for the carriage house, fully documented, plus my belongings returned intact, and a clean, uncontested separation. And a trade. If they made me whole and behaved, my mother would restructure the debt and sell the note to a boring institutional buyer who'd never know the Bennett name from any other account number on a spreadsheet. Nobody would lose the house over my broken heart. If they fought it, the first option came off the shelf by itself. Walter looked up from the page. In 30 years of practice, he said, the reasonable ones are always the scariest. The Bennett's family attorney, when Walter called, tried the town's favorite line. Surely this was a misunderstanding. A private family matter best kept private. Walter let him finish, then read him 2 numbers. The amount owed and the recorded instrument number of the mortgage. The line went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone finally takes their coat off. They proposed a meeting downtown, neutral ground. I said no. For 3 years, every hard conversation in that family had happened on their terms, at their table under their portraits with me in the guest chair. The one time the terms had truly been theirs, the day they chose a chain lock and a public sidewalk, they'd let the whole street watch me learn exactly what I was worth to them. The papers concern the house, I told my mother. The papers can visit the house. 10 o'clock Thursday morning we used the front door. I wore my audit blazer. Not new, not borrowed, mine bought with my own money. My mother wore her work one. Walter carried the briefcase. I knocked 3 even raps on 100 years of oak. Footsteps. The chain sliding back. And Patricia Bennett opened her own front door in full regalia, pearls and posture, the same speech already loaded behind her eyes. "Claire, this is not." Walter stepped forward, mild as a man delivering a casserole, and held out a business card and a single white envelope. "Walter Hale, counsel for the holder of the note and mortgage recorded against this property. You'll want to read this before you finish that sentence." I watched her take the envelope on committee autopilot. I watched her read the words notice of default and acceleration. And I watched something happen to her posture I had never once seen in 3 years. It broke from the top down, station by station. The eyebrows first, then the mouth, then her hand, reaching out to find the doorframe of the house her name was carved into, holding it the way you hold a railing on ice. "This is..." Her voice came out with no committee left in it at all. "Richard pays a company. This is some kind of trick." My mother, who had said nothing until then, spoke exactly one sentence, in the voice of 30 years behind an escrow desk. "The servicer just collects it, Patricia. I own it. Shall we do this in the doorway, or at your table? I've heard so much about it." For the first time since that family was invented, the door on the hill opened all the way for a Dawson. We sat at the same cherrywood table where I'd spent 3 years in the guest chair. Except this time I sat at its middle. Richard was summoned from the den and arrived already gray, which told me the words default and acceleration weren't new to him, only the name behind them was. Walter laid the documents out in a neat row. The assigned note, the recorded mortgage, years of $940 payments with a blank memo line, and the full itemized total owed. Patricia stared at the line where the note had changed hands 4 years earlier, and I watched her do the arithmetic backward through every Sunday dinner, every red circle in her own ledger, every dear, recalculating exactly who had been sitting in the guest chair the whole time. "Daniel," she called, her voice cracking on the name. "Come down here." My husband came down the same stairs he'd once watched me from, took in the table. His wife, her mother, a lawyer, the family's finances laid out like an autopsy, and stopped on the bottom step, arriving at last at the exact conversation he'd spent 5 years steering around. Patricia rallied once, pulling the old voice back on like a coat. "This house has stood for 100 years. This family built half this town. If you think a bookkeeper's mother with some company is going to frighten..." My mother let her finish. She never interrupts. She says the ends of sentences are where people confess. Then she folded her hands on the table and set the truth down like a foundation stone. "We don't buy names, Patricia. We buy ground. And the ground under your name has been in my handbag for 4 years." Something in Patricia gave out then, in a way I hadn't expected and didn't enjoy watching. She sat down fully, not the composed dissent she usually managed, and for a moment she was just a woman at a table she'd spent her whole life defending. "You think I was born at the head of this table," she said, to no one, maybe to the portraits. "I came into this family with 1 suitcase. I ate at the children's table for 10 years before anyone let me hold a serving spoon. Everyone who enters this house pays. That's how a name survives." And then she heard herself say it out loud in front of a bookkeeper, and the sentence died in her mouth. Her eyes found mine, and for 2 honest seconds, the only 2 we ever had, I understood her completely. She had once been exactly where I'd stood on that porch. She'd simply decided a long time ago that the fee was fair, because she'd already paid it herself. I didn't gloat. There was nothing left to win from her. I slid 1 page across the table, my terms 1 paragraph long. $38,000 for the carriage house. Documented, receipts attached. My belongings returned intact. A quiet, uncontested separation by the end of the week. In exchange, the debt would be restructured and the note sold to an institutional buyer who would never know their name from any other file. Nobody would lose the house because of me. That was the whole invoice, and it didn't compound. Then I stood, walked out to the porch, and did the one thing I'd carried in my pocket all morning. I set the brass carriage house key down on the white porch railing, exactly where the suitcases had once sat. "I'm returning the only thing of yours I ever wanted," I said. Behind me from the doorway Daniel said my name. I turned and looked at him for what felt like the closing of a long account. "You know where my mother's door is," I told him. "You've never once used it." I walked down those same 6 porch steps, into the same June light, past the same stretch of sidewalk where a chain lock had once taught me exactly what I was worth. Except this time I left on my own legs at my own pace, with my mother and her attorney falling in beside me like a small, exactly sized parade. Grief, I've learned, has good manners. It waited until we were home. That evening, after I fed Grace and handed her to her grandmother, I sat down at my mother's kitchen table and signed the separation paperwork Walter had left in a plain folder. My hand shook on the first line, not from doubt, but from the simple weight of closing something I'd once called a future. I signed. I dated it. By the last page, my handwriting had steadied, which felt like its own small proof of something. Then I opened the notebook from my nightstand, 3 years of quiet sandbagging, every payment, every invoice, and ruled a double line underneath the final entry, the way my first accounting teacher had taught me. Account closed. Nothing carried forward. The Bennetts paid the $38,000 within 6 months, raised the old-fashioned way. A boat sold first, then Richard's parade car. My boxes arrived that Saturday, packed with genuine care I recognized as Patricia's hand, whatever else was true about her. The separation went through uncontested, with full custody to me. Daniel gets his Saturdays with Grace and he's gentle with her. He was always gentle. Gentle was never the thing that was missing. My mother restructured the debt exactly as promised and sold the note, at a modest profit, to a pension fund servicing arm 2 states away, where the Bennett name is now 7 digits in a portfolio, filed neatly between a ranch house and a duplex that looked nothing like a castle. "I bought it as a firewall," my mother said, signing the transfer papers. "Never wanted a throne. Thrones need dusting." The following spring, a tasteful sign went up outside the stone gate. "Sold to a perfectly ordinary family with a trampoline in the yard." Nobody foreclosed on the Bennetts. Nobody had to. A borrowed name came due all on its own, the way it eventually always does. I simply stopped making the payments on it for them. My own practice reopened that fall in the same one-room office, with a new sign painted by a client's daughter. The clients I'd lost during my hardest months came back, and brought friends with them. And a strange, quiet second practice grew up around it. Young women, newly engaged, walking in with paperwork some new family had slid across a beautiful table and asked them to sign without reading. I go through every page with them, line by line, the way my mother once read mine, for years too early for me to understand why. I never charge for those visits. Call it a tithe to the escrow desk. Grace turned 1 this June. My mother took our photograph on the duplex porch, her in her work blazer, me holding the baby, both of us squinting slightly into the afternoon sun. It's not a good photograph, technically. It's the only 3-generation portrait I have ever actually been standing inside of. It hangs in my office now, where a certain fireplace photograph used to live only in my imagination. I look at it every working day, and I've never once noticed a fireplace missing from it. My key ring carries exactly 2 keys these days, my office and a small rented house 4 doors down from my mother's, with a porch just big enough for 2 chairs and a bassinet. Nobody holds a key to my life for the painters anymore. The gap on the ring is gone. It took me 31 years to understand what my mother tried to hand me over dinner when I was 12. So let me hand it to you now, free of charge, no ledger attached. A family that makes you pay your way and was never selling family at all. It was selling you a seat, and the rent on that seat never stops climbing. The people who actually belong to you pull the chair out for free at 3 in the morning, with no ledger anywhere in the house, because love that keeps books isn't love. It's a mortgage. And sooner or later someone always calls the note.